It's crazy, but it's
You're watching Channel Z, the world's leading zombie apocalypse channel, broadcasting live from Studio Z.
Makes me act the way I do.
Welcome to Eat, Pray, Run, where slow food in the apocalypse doesn't mean you're ending up on the menu. I hope you brought your appetites. I'm Dr. Erica O'Neill, and today we're discussing the zombifying powers of fungus with editor-in-chief of Fungi magazine, Britt Bunyard. But first, I would like to introduce the host of this show, Dr. Rob Dunn.
Hey, Erica. Great to see you today.
Yeah, what's the last really good fungus-based dish that you had?
Oh, I had a super good beer the other night, a homebrew wild fermented beer made by a local Copenhagen chef. And that was quite pleasing. That's not a meal, but it was meal-like.
Some of them are like a loaf of bread. A really good dark beer, heavy like
it was a bread in a bottle.
It can be a meal, yeah. I had a really good mushroom dish. I like making mushrooms and pasta. I don't get as many fancy ones, I'm sure, as the chefs who are off doing it in Copenhagen. But I just rely on my local grocery store. I've never foraged for mushrooms or anything, but I know someone who has, and I'm going to bring him on now. So our guest is Dr. Britt Bunyard. Britt researches fungus, is editor-in-chief of the Fungi magazine, and is the executive director of the Telluride Mushroom Festival, which sounds like a wonderful time. Britt, welcome to the show.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. Let's talk about beer. That's a favorite topic.
So I hear, is it true that you homebrew? I guess before we go there, though, my sense is from reading everything you do that fungi sort of take over your entire life. We're talking about zombies and zombie fungi today. Is it fair to say that you've been zombified? That the fungal world has pervaded every moment of your waking time?
Pretty much so, yeah. In addition to running the magazine, as you pointed out, and this festival, which will be coming up this summer, I'm also in the woods looking for mushrooms, like cooking with them. It's definitely been a big part of my life ever since I was a kid, starting out in the Midwest, looking for wild mushrooms with our family. We would go out looking for morels, and it's morel season right now. So it'll have me in the woods here pretty soon. I know morels are you're, I think, in Europe right now, so it's probably starting up morel season. Yep, and morels are just finishing up on the West Coast, so everyone's excited for them right now.
Do you have a favorite way to eat them?
Every way. Just sautéed and thrown into pretty much any kind of a dish. You can't go wrong. They're super useful in all situations, and it's also one of those mushrooms that, if you happen to be lucky enough to find a lot of them, you can dry them. They preserve super well, and you can use them throughout the year. And I think I even like them better after they've dried. It gets the flavor a little stronger. So it's just a great mushroom.
And when you eat them, do they remind you of your childhood? Do you feel like you're searching out these flavors of youth, or
kind of?
Fungus world's so different now that's now different.
It is. They have a very characteristic smell and taste in your mouth. And if I'm putting them in all kinds of fancy dishes, they're just excellent. But if I just saute them, especially at the beginning of the season, just saute them, and when I first taste them, it's just like when I was a kid, because that was the only way my family ate them. They just sauteed them and had them on a plate with other stuff. They didn't really put them into dishes. So, yeah, exactly. I think that's a lot of things kind of harken us back to our childhood and simpler times and stuff.
So in the context of those fungi, you've been zombified by them in some way. They please you, and you seek them out. But maybe we can now turn to some of the fungi that are more directly in control of animals. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the Cordyceps fungi? And what they do, what they're like?
Absolutely. And Cordyceps are a fairly large group that's within the ascomycete fungi. And ascomycetes include yeasts, which you've mentioned, and also morels, which we've mentioned. So this is the largest group of fungi. They're pretty unfamiliar to most people. Most people, if they know anything about fungi, it's usually big showy mushrooms, which is a different group of fungi, the Basidiomycetes.
Also a very good name for a band, Big Showy Mushrooms. I love.
Yes. So Yeah, the cordyceps are pretty cool because they're a group that specializes in parasitizing all sorts of different arthropods, especially so spiders, ants, moths and caterpillars, beetles, lots of different arthropods, and they often have sort of a specialized group of cordyceps that just attacks them. There's a specialized group of cordyceps that attacks only cicadas, and then there's related group of fungi within this whole sort of cordyceps larger group that attacks plants as well. So
Maybe
that's
we can go to some of the photos. I know you shared some with us. Erica, can you? So what are we looking at here, Britt?
okay. So this was one of our cover images from the magazine I published, Fungi magazine. This is a cordyceps that has attacked some sort of an insect. I don't know if it's a beetle or maybe it's a grasshopper actually. And so what happens is the fungus lives inside the immature stages of the insect, and eventually when the insect is going to go through metamorphosis, it settles down somewhere or maybe digs in under the soil and then changes into the adult stage. But if it's in the case that it's been attacked by this fungus, it's not going to become an adult. It's going to sprout these large fruit bodies of the fungus, which will blast spores and then complete the whole life cycle. So this is a type of a cordyceps we have here in North America, and most people don't see them because all that sticks up out of the ground are these little projections, and oftentimes they're just brown and kind of blend in with the surroundings, but they're pretty common. Cordyceps that more people have probably heard of would be something like this. This is a cordyceps that's world famous. This is one of the most important and economically important medicinal mushrooms in the world. This is the cordyceps that attacks the ghost moth larvae in Tibet, and that's what you see there at the bottom of that black stalk. That's the caterpillar. The ghost moth lives out on the Tibetan plateau. It's sort of like a prairie and eats a lot of grass. And when it settles down to metamorphose and go from a caterpillar to a moth, it overwinters underground, but in the springtime, it's not going to turn into a moth. This guy's been attacked by the fungus, and instead of moth, it's going to sprout this large structure, which will make spores of the ghost moth. It's pretty cool because this is a huge deal in Tibet. This is a large portion. In fact, it's the largest portion of the entire economy of Tibet, which is a big southern area of China. And everyone in the spring, when this thing's coming out, forming these fruit bodies, everyone heads into the mountains to collect these things because they're worth, comparable in weight to gold. Actually, I think maybe even several times the weight of gold. And it's used as a mushroom medicine in apothecary shops and things like that.
And so part of the reason, if I understand right, that these fungi are useful is that they're producing all sorts of chemicals to manipulate the body of the host that are then also being used in the human medicinal context. Is that right?
Pretty much. I mean, a lot of this is anecdotal and has been used for centuries in Eastern medicine to cure or prevent ailments and just overall health. However, in more recent times, there have been actual Western medicines made from these same fungi. So, as an example, cyclosporine, which is a common medicine that you can get prescribed in the West, comes from this fungus. So, they have for sure things that have been detected and isolated from the organism and then turned into medicines. The interesting thing about this cordyceps fungus in that caterpillar is forever it was wondered how the fungus got into the caterpillar. It was only just recently, last couple of years, figured out that the fungus actually lives as an endophyte inside the grass, much like claviceps, which causes ergot on plants, lives in the grass. And it's so probably as the plant is being grazed by the caterpillar, gets into the caterpillar that way. And this same group of fungi, the cordyceps type fungi, are also close relatives of other cordyceps that attack ants and other things, like the zombie fungi.
Oh, I think we had a photo. Yeah. So what's going on in this photo, Britt?
So pretty much similar thing. You see a really long stalk sticking out of what was an ant, and the ant picks up the fungus somehow crawling along, breathes it in or ingests it, and it's still not really known. But what happens is then the fungus starts living on the tissues inside of the ant, and right before it's time to reproduce, the fungus then takes over control of the ant's body without killing it yet, takes over control of the ant's body and mind, and causes the ant to have the urge to climb up really, really high on something, and usually right above the walkway of the ants. You've seen trails of ants coursing about in your backyard or on a sidewalk or wherever. And so then it causes the ant to grasp with its mandible onto whatever substrate. You can see those are clenching a twig of some sort, and holds on basically in this death grip, and then the ant dies, and then the fruit body starts emerging out the back of the ant. So that long stalk you see there is fungal stromal tissue, and that gray kind of bump up near the top of that stalk, that's the actual fruit body where the spores are made, and then they will blast out of that thing and rain down on the ant colony below, or the ants crawling below. Pretty cool.
But so in a way, is it right to think about this as like the akin to the world's laziest mushroom? That it's convinced the ants to go up as though it had made an enormous stem, and then the spores can rain down from the body.
Yeah, it's pretty well calculated so that the fungus really doesn't have to do a whole lot of work. That the work was all in the evolution, getting to this point. Getting inside the ant and then making sure it can get back inside the next ant. So
are you saying you don't want me to call it lazy? Is that not good? I feel like it's successful lazy. It's something we could all aspire to.
I guess so. I guess you could. I mean, it's sort of like the grasshopper and the ant type story, right? The grasshopper has it figured out so he can just sit there all through the season. But what he doesn't know is winter's coming and the ant's been socking away food. So,
I think. We need to update our parables to reflect the role of fungi. I think we didn't know enough about fungi when all these old stories were being written, and now we know so much more. They're actually much better characters for these stories.
Absolutely. There's a lot of different fungi that are lazy, if you want to call it that, in the same way, and they infect plants. And now, how to get their spores into another plant of the same species, and they do kind of similar things as these cordyceps in that they produce like pseudo flowers off of the plant that looks like a flower. Bees come along and attempt to pollinate and then pick up the spores, and now they take it to an actual flower, and then that's the entry point for the fungal spores to get inside the next plant. So it's kind of a similar idea, but with a plant infecting type fungus.
And what kinds of fungi are those? Oh, and let's get to ergot. So they're great. This is a question about ergot. So tell us what kinds of fungi those are. But then also, I think one way we can back out of this a little bit is to think about, are there fungi like these cordyceps that infect humans? Is it possible that you or I is infected with something right now that's changing our behavior? And how does ergot fit into all of this? Does ergot control us? Is it an accident of its biology?
Well,
first the name of that fungus. Now let's go to those. Yeah.
Yep. So the fungi that infect plants and produce pseudo flowers or some sort of structure like that, or false looking fruits or whatever, there's a number of different ones, and they're not even very closely related evolutionarily. There's rusts and some other things that do that. Ergot, however, is one that also does this sort of thing. So it is sort of a good segue. Ergot is in the same group as is in the Cordyceps group. So this is a group of fungi that are well known for parasitizing plants and living inside of them as an endophyte, or sort of a part of the inside of the plant. When it's time to reproduce on the top of the grass plant like rye or a number of different grains, instead of the grain being produced there, it'll be replaced by stromal tissue, which looks kind of like that gray bump on that cordyceps. It works the same way. It's going to have spores blasting out of it. Yeah. So if you can imagine the seed head of wheat or rye or something like that, every once in a while, or even a lot of grasses that grow around your house, every once in a while, one of those little kernels will be replaced by a dark kernel that's usually a little bigger. So that's kind of the telltale sign that something's different. And in any case, that's not really a mass of spores. It's a mass of fungal tissue that will sit on the ground along with the grain of that grass. And when it's time for the grass to start producing a flower, that's when that little stroma will germinate and produce sort of mushroom-like little tiny structures that will blast spores that then reinfect the flower of the grass. You don't want to eat these things, by the way, because again, this is the part of the plant that would normally get eaten by grazing animals. Well, the fungus has another defense against that to keep itself from being eaten and digested, and that's some of these powerful alkaloid, very bitter toxins that if you were to ingest them, can cause hallucinations and constriction of your blood vessels and a number of problems. And so, as one example, LSD and some actual pharmaceuticals that have been developed for prescription have come from these fungi. But surreptitious eating of this can poison people and cause St. Anthony's fire and a number of disorders. The Salem witch trials are believed to have been caused by a mass ergotism. And there's been mass ergotisms in modern times. In a town in France, the entire town in the 50s suffered a mass ergotism where you can die from it. So it's not something you want to try to experience LSD, but one of the symptoms is mass hallucination and weird sensations and stuff like that.
Well, so I've got two questions around that. One is, why isn't it then more common? Why don't we, is something about industrial agriculture make it rarer than it was historically? And then also, it's been argued that Hieronymus Bosch's paintings, that some of them might have been inspired by ergot. Is it plausible given what we know about the fungus? And if is it at the heart of great Dutch art?
Yeah, it's quite plausible. So we don't see a number of these things on modern cultivated grains and other plants so much because a lot of times resistance to these pathogens has been bred into the plants. However, older heirloom plants like rye absolutely is still susceptible to this, and also all sorts of wild grasses. Ergots are actually quite common. People don't often see them just because you're not looking for them and they're really small, and you couldn't really look for it on your lawn because you're going to mow the grass. You're not going to let it grow for an entire season and go to seed. But if you look on the margins of fields and things, it's actually pretty common, believe it or not. And there's ergots that attack all sorts of different grasses. There's even ergot of corn. So if you, at the end of the season, have a whole bunch of corn stalks at your house, you're in Europe, so I guess you'd call it maize. You would have, if you have a whole bunch of corn stalks, you might see some of the ears that nobody ever bothered to harvest. Some of the kernels will look kind of weird and fat and pink. Those will be ergot of corn, which is a different species. And again, don't eat them because they're quite toxic. It's not how you get LSD into your body. You get a lot of other stuff with it, and it's not pleasant.
So would you know if you'd eaten them? Do they taste different? I mean, I guess if they're a warning by the ergot, they should be bitter, right? Yeah. So these are alkaloid type compounds, so they're extremely bitter. Caffeine is an alkaloid. So if you've ever accidentally bitten down on a no-dose, taking a no-dose to stay awake while you're driving long distance, if you don't choke it down, if you happen to find it. More about your personal life than we wanted to know. Yeah.
It's just they're extremely bitter, and they also cause sort of a gagging reflex. So an animal that's would be eating these things has the propensity to gag and throw up, and of course that would be just what the fungus would want. It doesn't want to get passed through the animal.
So Athena has a great question here, really about the idea that it seems like often the fungus is taking control over an animal or a plant, sort of at a transitional life stage, and in some of these cases, sort of in late life stages when an organism is sick or dying. To what extent are the fungi associated with a very healthy or animal or plant, a sick animal or plant, and a dead animal or plant very different? I mean, can you track the well-being of somebody or something as a function of what fungi are having their
Yeah,
way?
that's an excellent point. So both plants and animals, are going to be more susceptible to infection when they're already older or sickened or weakened from something. And that's because both plants and animals have a sort of an immune system. Plants don't truly have an immune system like our immune system, and insects have an immune system too. But they do have a system to fend off infection. And how they often do it is by localized cell death, which kind of contains a pathogen and then kind of kills it in this, sort of a localized area. So if you think about wood that you have around your house, wood cabinets or guitars or something like that, or bowls or vases or anything made of wood, a lot of people like to make things out of wood that is spalted and has these beautiful kind of black lines running around through it, like bird's eye maple or curly maple or some of these things. There's no such thing as bird's eye maple or curly maple. This is wood that's been attacked by microbes, and the plant walls the infection off by producing melanin and other things to kind of contain it. Well, as trees get older or more and more sickened from other beetles and insects and fungi and microbes, their ability gets weakened, and so more things tend to attack them. And that's the same with us and same with insects. So the question about some of these pathogens hitting the insect when it's metamorphosing, that's a very interesting point. It's not always the case. So like the case with the ants and spiders and some other things I can think of, they get attacked by the fungus and it just kills them whenever it gets in, and then it's like 30 days later at a certain time period, it then comes back out. But with some of these Lepidoptera and Cordyceps, it definitely does seem to begin at one stage and always fruits sort of in between that halfway stage when things are metamorphosing. So I think it's maybe just sort of species specific.
With the ants, in that context, because the fungus is in the ant when it's still alive for a while sometimes, and then at some point the balance of power starts to tip, and so that it's more and more alive with fungus and less alive with ant.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And the way we describe that as humans is that the ant dies and the fungus is sort of continues to live. But on the other hand, if we think about the relationship between species as being more fluid, does anything ever really die in that relationship, or is it just a kind of more complicated metamorphosis? Are we thinking about this all wrong? Do fungi really blur the lines between alive and dead? And I mean, when you see the fungi coming up out of the ground in the forest in the form of these mushrooms you love so much, or in the form of these fruiting bodies off of insects, do you think of it as a kind of rebirth, or what? How do you think about it?
Well, it certainly is a continuum. When you look at organisms, I mean, you often don't really know what makes an organism. First of all, I mean, you can know the entire genome sequence of a human, but that doesn't make a human. There's all sorts of microbes that are part of our flora that contribute certain vitamins of our diet and contribute certain beneficial properties of our immune system, etc. So what makes a human is not just human DNA and human cells. In fact, human cells are not even the majority of our cells. When you look at a human, there's many more microbial cells in and on you than your human cells, believe it or not. So that's pretty astounding. But when you look at trees and things like that, I mean, the average person couldn't imagine what you see when you see a tree. Trees are there because of fungi. There are fungi farming the tree underground. The tree could not live without that fungus. It does all the heavy lifting of nutrient and water uptake for the tree. Furthermore, when you look at the stem and the branches, what you see there is almost entirely dead material. Only the skin underneath the bark of a tree is alive, and the leaves, of course. But all that heartwood, that's all just dead tissue. So all that could be completely rotted out and full of fungus. So you could really have a lot more mass there that's fungus than actual plant.
But so if I hear you right, you're saying that when you see a forest, what you see is a bunch of plants the fungi have taken control of in order to achieve their ultimate goal of controlling everything.
Yeah, I think a lot of people see the forest and think, the trees are the main producer and they're in control of everything, but it's pretty much more like the fungus is in control of everything. There's fungi in the soil that control the roots. There's fungi that live epiphytically on the surface of the plants, covering the plants, lichens and things like that. And then there's fungi within the tissues, the endophytic fungi. So it's, this whole idea of the Gaia principle, where everything in nature is connected. The more we look at the ecosystem, the more we find it really is true. All the organisms, the animals and everything really, really are connected to one another and rely on a number of different things being in place and having to happen if it all works.
So this is a good point, I think, to come back around to your home brewing of beer.
Sure.
So I think this is, as we think about our own lives and we go back into our own lives, that one of the places we encounter fungi all the time is in the form of yeasts in our food, yeasts in our drinks. And so do you make your home brew in the same building you're in, right in the same space you're in right now? Is the yeast floating around you?
I don't really use any wild yeasts just because, and I even make, Belgian and sour beers and stuff like that, but I usually don't really make any beer, wine with wild yeast just because you never really know how stuff's going to happen. Sometimes it's fun not to know, but sometimes it's not if you have to leave it sit for a long period of time. So I usually use commercial yeast, but they came from somewhere. They came from the wild. It's just that they've been selected because some do a better job than others, or emote certain properties or smells or tastes or whatever. But so I don't really do any like open cask fermenting like lambics and things like that.
Well, that brings us back around. So Carl had a question earlier, and it was about how much of the microbiome is composed of fungi that we miss because of our microbiome measures just look at bacteria. We did a study a couple of years ago now where we had bakers all make the same sourdough starter. And longer story short, what we found is that the baker's hands were actually covered with yeast, that the act of being a baker had transformed them. Yeah. And then recent studies have shown that humans have way more yeast in their guts than we used to think, just as part of their normal microbiome. Yeah. And so I wonder, with your life amongst the fungi, how many species of fungi do you think are on you and in you at any given point?
I don't know. That's a really good point about the bakers having a lot of yeast sort of impregnating their skin. Here's an interesting story, though, about how much stuff you can pick up. With myself, I'm not really a germaphobe, but I do wash, so I probably don't have a whole lot of different mushroom spores or whatnot on my person. However, a famous mycologist, sort of a chemical mycologist in the Pacific Northwest, Michael Buge, he, amongst other areas of research, was the one who pinned down the amounts of active properties in hallucinogenic mushrooms in the genus psilocybe. So he told me that probably the highest diversity of psilocybe species was probably at his house, right outside the house. And when I asked him why, he's like, well, there's a lot of wood chips and stuff. I have all these flower beds and things. There's a lot of stuff to rot. But, after working in the lab for like 30 years and coming home and shaking out my lab coat and hanging it up there in the garage, just a lot of spores probably fell off. And now I have all kinds of different species growing at my house. And he's not into eating magic mushrooms, which is kind of too bad because he could be sitting on a gold mine, but just so happens that that's how the fungi were getting around.
And now we know, for all the people who are into eating them, where they should go.
You never find this place. It's in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific Northwest.
So I thought I would end our conversation on just a couple of crossover recs. This is Liz Grumbach, who also hosts Brain Dead Theater, bringing up a movie called The Girl with All the Gifts about zombies caused by fungal infections, and The Last of Us for video game fans. So there's a lot of crossover and potential for zombifying fungus in humans too, that people have examined in literature and creatively. So,
Erica, there was that book that was just published just within the last year. This was kind of if I can hold it up. kind of a cool story, and it has to do with sort of a weird strain of cordyceps getting loose and attacking people, and it's kind of a pretty neat mystery. We had a short story in Fungi magazine a few years back, kind of along the same lines, where what would happen if we got attacked by a cordyceps and then, we were subjected to summit disease, where we wanted to climb up really high on top of a building and hold on and then explode with spores. Yeah.
Well,
pretty
that's
gruesome.
some food for thought that you can all take with you into the rest of your morning. Thank you so much for joining us today, Britt. It was a pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah,
That was
pleasure to
great,
be here.
Britt. Thank you.
Yeah, sure thing. My pleasure.
And thank all of you for joining us today for Eat, Pray, Run. We hope to see you next time. And until then, please make sure to eat well. We'll see you around.
I know it's crazy, but it seems so logical. I can't deny that there is something supernatural with you.